Hi, good evening. Welcome to the Speed Art Museum and the Speed Cinema. I'm Dean Otto. I'm the curator of film here at the Speed. I want to welcome you into our incredible cinema space this evening here for today's discussion on Chagall in School. There are a couple of people I really want to thank, primarily Jeff and Susan Callan. They are the co-chairs of the Speed Cinephiles, the supporters of the Speed Cinema program, and they are the ones who initiated this partnership for bringing this program here this evening, and they're wonderful supporters of all that goes on here in this room, too. And speaking of things going on in this room, we are going to be partnering with the Louisville Jewish Film Festival and the JCC coming up here. Great. We have partnered every year that they've been presenting the film festival since we opened in 2016. So on Sunday, February 18th at 5 p.m., we're going to be screening a film called Seven Blessings. We have flyers outside in the Speed Cinema lobby too. I hope you can make it to this incredible film. It was Israel's submission for the Best International Oscar this past year too. So as I got into my car to drive over here tonight, there was a wonderful WFPL story about Chagall in School playing, and I was like, oh, it's just leading me right into tonight's program here too. But we're so happy to have you all here tonight for tonight's discussion. And without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to David Chuck. Yeah. All right, thanks.
Wow, I didn't know that they did the audio yesterday on our play. So this is like, can people hear me okay? I'm trying to, this mic is a little soft, but I'll do my best. And thank you, Dean, for having us here in your home and for this beautiful space for us to do the presentation. And also I have to thank Sue and Jeff Callan so much, because this really wouldn't have happened without them. And Stacy Gordon-Funk, I don't know if Dean had thanked her formerly. He works with her, so he probably just thinks, oh, she's so great, she doesn't need to be thanked. But she is, she's great, and she needs to be thanked. So please. And then other people who worked on it, Megan, I don't know Megan's last name, and Sean I think is up in the booth, and these people are making it happen. So the seamless things that are going on here are actually being done by real people who care, who really do care. And art and culture is something that I care very much about, and Chagall cared very much about, and we really want you to come see Chagall in School, because not only is it important because it helps support me, I mean, I don't know if you care about me, but it also supports arts and Jewish arts, and how today, unfortunately, there's so much that's being done to kind of erase Jewishness in the arts. Often when I talk about Marc Chagall or ask people about Marc Chagall and say, do you know anything about him? They don't know that he's Jewish. And you would think, oh, it's so obvious. I mean, we have paintings that kind of show his Jewishness to some extent. If you know what the goat symbol means, you know, that was part of our title, you know, what's with the goats? Why so many goats? Which is actually a line in the play, so you've got to come see the play and see how it is. And there's a reason for that comes directly out of his Jewish heritage. And Chagall, one of the great things about Chagall, I'll go right into my talk now because I'm leading into it. And then you've got to stay for David Raskin, because he's going to be much better than me. David number 2. Chagall never left Vitebsk. If you look here in this painting that was done, that's the Speed's painting, that's right upstairs here, waiting. What is he waiting for? What is the waiting? Here we see a beautiful angel, and then at first, actually, I think what I'm drawn to is the yellow goat. maybe people can start thinking, why a yellow goat? What is it about yellow that is so unique if we're thinking about a goat as a Jewish symbol? And then, what is underneath the goat and the angel and the rooster and love? That's Vitebsk. Vitebsk in red. What is he thinking about? And what is he portraying? And I want us to go back in time a little bit in order to understand some context, and then I'm going to go to some iconic figures that Chagall did, and we'll get more to goats later. We've got to give up the goats a little bit. It's actually a line in my play, too. So, little sneak previews. But going back in time, when Chagall lived in the early 1900s, as a young man, he grew up not only in a Jewish shtetl. For those of you who have seen Fiddler on the Roof, you know about Anatevka, this kind of fictionalized Jewish shtetl, but this was exactly the town right near where Sholem Aleichem came from. This was the town where, when we talk about Lubavitcher Hasidim, Lubavitch was right nearby. In fact, Chagall went and had a meeting to try to figure out the direction of his life, and he met with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he felt after his meeting that the Rebbe didn't tell him anything. But Chagall still grew up not only in this very Jewish environment of, one might say, a traditional Jewish heritage, but he also grew up with a very progressive and idealistic, young, enlightened Jewish heritage as well. Because what was going on in the late 1800s, early 1900s, was a refurbishing, a renewal of Jewish culture. Not only Jewish culture in order to feel comfortable about one's identity, but also a Jewish culture that was purporting and believing that there was something intrinsic within being a Jew and with being part of a greater world that came together, and that Jewish culture was also part of world culture. For instance, one of the groups, let me just switch glasses because I wanted you to think I was pretty, but I'll put on one of my ugly glasses now so I can read. There was a group called the Mahmadim. Mahmad means something that is desirous, that we want to be a part of. This was a Jewish artistic group. And the word Mahmad, I went to look it up because I wasn't that familiar with it. It means something that is worthy of praise, but also something that is an object of desire. And what they were doing in their art and in their Enlightenment thinking was revealing and unearthing the parts of being a Jew and parts of Jewish culture and parts of Jewish identity that were objects of worthy desire. Because the word itself goes all the way back to one of the most erotic pieces of literature in the world that's so Jewish, the Song of Songs. Yes? And what is the word used in? What is the sentence it comes from? In Song of Songs 5:16, you can go look it up. His mouth is delicious, and all of him is mahmad, worthy of my desire. Such is my beloved, such is my darling, O maidens of Jerusalem. She's speaking to the Queen of Sheba, by the way, is speaking to to her maidens about King Solomon and about his earthly pleasures for her. These artists were using Judaism in order to create an art that was robust, that had ideas, that yes, depicted their own lives, but if you look a little bit deeper and you look not only on the surface of what they're portraying, you'll see that they're also being very revolutionary. First of all, it was very revolutionary just to be a Jew. I mean, what was going on in the late 1800s, early 1900s in a very constant way? Pogroms, a time period when Jews were massacred and slaughtered, unfortunately quite often after Easter or before Easter, leading up to Easter, because Jews were accused of killing Jesus. And so, you know, that was something that maybe had to be done sometime. Chagall wrote as a boy, I felt at every step, growing up in Vitebsk, that is, it's not here, but I'm putting that in. I felt at every step that I was a Jew. People made me feel it. During a pogrom, Chagall wrote, the street lamps are out. I feel panicky, especially in front of butchers' windows. And there you can see calves still alive, lying beside the butchers' hatchets and knives. And when asked by some pogromniks, Jew or not, Chagall remembered thinking, my pockets are empty, my fingers sensitive, my legs weak, and they are out for blood. My death would be futile. I so wanted to live. So Chagall denied being a Jew. And the pogromniks shouted, all right, get along. This was the life he grew up in. This was what he knew. And this is also how he was seen by others when he went to France. So interesting, there's a poem that was written by Blaise Cendrars. I had to look him up. I didn't know who he was. A poet, a Swiss poet and writer. And they were all part of this surrealist group in France at the time he was there in the early 1900s. And then he and Bertha, later to become Bella, we talked about that earlier, they went back to France after he was kicked out of his Chagall Institute for Art, or out of the Institute for Art that he started. That's also in my play. And Blaise Cendrars wrote a poem about him. He wrote, he sleeps, he wakes, suddenly he paints. He takes a church and paints with the church. He takes a cow and paints with a cow. With a sardine, with heads, hands, knives. He paints with a bullwhip. He paints with all the dirty passions of a small Jewish town, with all the heightened sexuality of provincial Russia. For France, without sensuality, he paints with his thighs, his eyes in his arse. And suddenly, it's your portrait, it's you, reader, it's me, it's him, it's his fiancée, it's the local grocer, the milkmaid, the midwife. They're tubs of blood. The newborn are washed there, insane skies, mouths of modernity. The tower is corkscrew, some hands. Christ, he's Christ. He spent his childhood on the cross. He suicides every day. Suddenly he no longer paints. He was awake, now he sleeps, chokes on his tie. Chagall's astonished to still be alive. So, what was one of the most iconic images that Chagall painted over and over and over again that actually has influenced theater, influenced one of the most incredible shows ever about Jewish culture, that continually is done over and over again, and now with the death of Norman Jewison, people are thinking about it a little bit more again, although it's also been reworked in interesting ways. I think as appropriately it should be, given the times that we're in and the rise of anti-Semitism. This is his painting of, oh right, here is the fiddler from an early painting of his. Now when you look at this, let me switch glasses again, sorry. You know, what are we looking at? We're looking at a man playing a fiddle, looks kind of rural, Russian, wears a Russian hat. Does he look particularly Jewish? Maybe, maybe not. And it's just kind of a nice little scene. Little boy there. What is the boy doing? Just kind of standing there. Sort of like a still life. Doesn't really provoke any heavy feelings or passions or anything like that. But by painting a fiddler, and I'm so glad they, with the title, has it as F-I-D-L-E-R, it's not just fiddler, not just something from Kentucky. It's fiddler. Who was a fiddler? A fiddler was a Jewish klezmer. And a klezmer was a Jewish musician that was necessary, that was so important in Jewish cultural life. Klezmer music, Yiddish music, culture, the meaning of a fiddler who traveled from place to place to play at weddings, to play at celebrations, to play on holidays. They were itinerant musicians. You never knew what exactly they were doing behind the scenes in the barns, but you couldn't imagine a wedding without them. And they also embodied a sense of Jewishness, and their cultural necessity for the community was important. So when we're looking at a fiddler, we're not just looking at any person here. We're looking at an embodiment of this Jewish cultural community. And you know, you can see it's kind of in his early time period. It has a sort of, and I'm not the art historian, we'll have David here to bring us through some of this. We're looking at a little bit, I think, of his Cubist styles, also maybe some styles people say it was influenced by Russian iconography as well, Christian iconography, and looking at taking Jewish figures, but doing them in a kind of Russian iconographic way. Okay, let's move on now. Where's my clicker? Let's see if it works. Yay. Now, this is getting a little bit more intense. We not only have the musician, or I would say the klezmer, these things kind of get lost in the translation. So the klezmer here is not just holding a fiddle, he seems to be clutching the fiddle. Maybe embracing, although if you look at his face, I don't know about that. And there are also paintings, we didn't put this up in the slides, but paintings of his father. And when you look at the paintings of Chagall, that Chagall did of his father, you see a somewhat similar look of perhaps someone who is tired, someone who is drawn. Chagall's father was what he called, literally, he called him a herring schlepper. And he would get up at about 3 or 4 in the morning, every day, except Shabbos, except the Sabbath. He'd get up and he'd take the herring fish and he would marinate them in the barrels and he would move them from place to place. And that was a good job, because some people were out of work. He never had a lack of food in his life. He lived a quite poor early life, but he never saw his father. And his father worked night and day, barely, coming home at night, late at night. He'd have a little bit to eat. They'd maybe schmooze a little bit, and that would be it. And he died when Chagall was young, I think in his early teens. And here we see him clutching this fiddle, this white fiddle. And that's interesting as well. Okay, I'm going to move it along. here we see a lot that's going on. We see the fiddle now, a fiddler, once again, entitled a fiddle, the early part of his career, 1912, 1913. This is before his Institute of Art that he was a part of in Vitebsk, in his Jewish town. And you see it in two tones. You see the fiddler in two tones, and then you see the green face. And Chagall did a series of paintings of Jews, often called the Jew series, not meant in an anti-Semitic way, but meant to show a Jew, perhaps, in a situation that is unique to the Jew. Because when you look at the fiddler now, what is the fiddler standing on? A roof. All right. You know, what could be more incredible than a fiddler on the roof? And that, in fact, is what influenced the people who put together Fiddler on the Roof from a monograph that the great stage designer, who knew Chagall as well, Boris Aronson from Vitebsk, wrote about him and said, this artist, this genius, is able to depict Jewish life in a way that shows the precariousness, the liminality of being a Jew, and not knowing whether one is going to stand or whether one is going to fall off or whether one is just floating in the air. Chagall often had his paintings where the characters, the goats, the lovers are all floating. And so, you know, there's so much that we can look at this painting and see so much in it. And in the background is a church. And why not? They lived among people who weren't Jewish. And the churches, as some of you may know, were always taller than the synagogues. You couldn't have a synagogue that was taller than a church. And here he is in Vitebsk again. Vitebsk in the background as well. So this ongoing icon of what it means to be a Jew. Let's see what else. You put in some other slides here too. Two more. Yeah. Here we go. Chagall clearly making this figure, this fiddler, a Jew. So there's no mistake, in case you were wondering. He's wearing a tallis, the ritual garment that is worn by very Orthodox Jews, actually under their clothing, as well as on top during prayer services, and in this case, putting it on top. And then the fiddler himself playing, and what's in the background? You know, maybe it's, once again, he's on roofs, two different roofs. Here we have our goat, thank you. The goat is often in Chagall's paintings, just out of nowhere. And why a goat? I'm gonna leave that for you to think about a little bit more. We'll get there. And then the kind of dreamy, imaginative background of perhaps clouds or heaven, or, you know, maybe people watching, maybe there's thunder in the distance, kind of depicting. Now Chagall is 1920s, he's out of Vitebsk. He's been forced out by Malevich, who comes in, Casimir Malevich, into his art institute, and which is in our play, by the way. And then he goes to Moscow, and then from there is able to get to France, where he lives until the rise of fascism and Nazism. Well, I don't want to get into that right now. And then here, take a look at this. Yes, there's a fiddler. The fiddler is probably the least distinguished character here in the painting. Also, one of the things I love about Chagall is he's always telling stories, and also shows why Chagall went into theater and why theater came out of him. And here we see someone who died, We don't exactly see why, except as my students said when I showed this to them, they said, why is there like some other color, this darker color that's around them? What happened here? Is this the result of a pogrom? This woman screaming and this person cleaning up. Cleaning what? Are they cleaning blood? So here's and the title is Death. So here we have Chagall doing a painting of a fiddler now being a witness to the lives that they led as Jews. And this was something that Chagall never, ever forgot. Let me switch this here right now. He never forgot Vitebsk. You know, the boy may have left Vitebsk, but Vitebsk never left the boy. And he realized that he always had Vitebsk with him and took that with him. And Chagall's work has so much influence when we look at what's going on today. In fact, I can say this publicly because it was published in the community Jewish newspaper. Our Federation CEO, Jewish Federation CEO, Sarah Wagner, was recently at a museum. She wrote about this in Jewish Community News. And she wrote about going to the museum in Milwaukee and viewed a Chagall painting. And the Chagall painting depicted a brutal pogrom. She doesn't identify which one it is. Maybe it was this one. And Sarah writes that the docent explained about pogroms of Eastern Europe, that they were violent rioting and ransacking of Jewish villages. The pogroms were intentionally planned attacks, pulling Jews out of their homes, raping all of the Jewish women, and murdering as many Jews as possible. Sound familiar? Then, as the docent told the assembled group that the Russians killed the Jews because they believed the Jews were responsible for killing Jesus, a couple passed by where they were standing, and the man gave a thumbs up and smiled as he whispered to his companion, "That's right." At that instant, Sarah goes on, I remembered an ongoing difficult truth. We cannot assume others understand our history and the legacy of hate that our ancestors experienced. So with that, I'll end right now and bring on David number 2. And thank you. More to come.
Hi, everybody. Delighted to be here. I had art classes in this museum when I was a little boy, but this is the first time I've been back to speak to such a lovely audience like this. And I'm glad David ended on such a downer because it's going to get worse from here. But let's have a little moment of relief. I just wanted to point out that this is the speech Chagall. If you haven't seen it, it's right outside on the wall there. And born Moishe Siegel, Vitebsk, present-day Belarus, 99 years old. So there's a lot of Chagall. He had an incredible career. Mostly we know Chagall for the fables and folklore and joy, love, flowers. For me, that's the before and the after. I'm talking about everything tonight that's in the middle. But I wondered where exactly Vitebsk was. So I went to Google. So you can see Moscow's all the way over there. And then Poland is over here. You can see Lithuania, Vilna. Walk around. Vilna's there, and I'll be talking about Vilna soon. But you can see this man was born far east, and Vitebsk was in what was called the Pale of Settlement of the Russian Empire. It's about 50,000 people, it's a big place, maybe half Jewish, was razed by the Nazis in 1944. And like all artists of this time, Chagall traveled a lot. The European avant-garde moved from city to city, forming communities, finding new art ideas, staking their territory against traditional practices. So he went to St. Petersburg, Paris, back to Vilna, Moscow, Berlin, Paris, escaped the Nazis to New York City, returned to Paris as early as 1947. And while, David was saying that Chagall never left Vilna, Chagall disagreed, partly. But he said lots of things. He lived 99 years. So on the left, I've got Wangri's portrait of Picasso. And you notice Picasso's holding the palette, just like Chagall in his self-portrait with 7 fingers is holding the palette. And of course, he's painting one of his traditional shtetl scenes, the cow. But you can see the Eiffel Tower through the window and the Hebrew writing. Chagall actually says, I was born in Vitebsk, but I was also born in Paris. So I've got Chagall here at the most exciting moment of the European avant-garde, at the birth of Cubism. And of course, there's Picasso and Chagall. So he was a celebrity very early in his career, found success quite young. Lots of supporters, lots of dealers who were interested in him, commissioned him to illustrate their books. Lots of dealers who had shows. And this is Franz Marc, the German expressionist. And I just wanted to show you, floating cows and floating cows. So we've got the Marc floating cows. But look at Chagall's cow. The cow is dreaming another cow. And then this was Blaise Cendrars that David was talking about, the Swiss poet, actually Jewish, or at least the Gestapo thought so. His wife was Jewish, and I couldn't figure out if Cendrars himself was. He made the Gestapo list of Jews. And Sonia Delaunay Turk, and this is their famous collaborative poem on the right. It's the art by Sonia Delaunay Turk and the poetry by Blaise Cendrars. And it's what they call the first simultaneous poem. It's about 6 feet long. These pages are all taped together. And on the right, I'm showing you the Cubist or Fist influenced Eye in the Village, which is probably one of your favorites. And I just want to point out a few things in here. Of course, you've got the goat that Dave is interested in, the person here with a cross around their neck. And although you can't tell, you're going to have to trust me on this. That's the Star of David right there on the finger. So we get the fragmented picture plane. We get the goat dreaming the cow. We get this circulation of images that a Christian philosopher Catholic philosopher in 1934 named Jacques Maritain called the fluid chaos of the soul, where are born symbols, all moving for their uncertainty. So one thing with Chagall is, although we can recognize some imagery, it's exceptionally difficult to put it together to any sort of stable image or stable story. You recognize a story's being told, but the actual literal meaning of that is left to your memory, it's left to your imagination, it's left to the cultural, historical, heritage associations that you bring to these images to make meaning from them. And then, of course, the Edvard Munch on the left, Golgotha, and Chagall's version on the right, Calvary. So you can see the crucified Christ up here in a visual style that looks a lot like the earlier Cubist or Orphist style that we've just seen. There are at least 25 of these crucifixion paintings by Marc Chagall. And Jewish scholars have drawn their attention to this, in the last few decades, specifically an Israeli named Ziva Emershe Maysels, and more recently, Kenneth Silver. They've done a great job of excavating the history of Chagall's interest in crucifixion scenes. And of course, the main interest was coming out of the 19th century. It was a 19th century theological push to do Christ as the Jewish martyr and also as the Christian Messiah. So Chagall's first crucifixion painting is 1908. He did them until 1912 and then stopped. He takes them up again in 1938 after Kristallnacht. And just to show you this Jewish interest in the Jewish Messiah, I'm showing you two earlier versions of it. Morrissey Gottlieb, Christ teaching at Capernaum, right there, and obviously Christ is dressed as a Jew. And then a more subtle piece by Joseph Israels of the Kaddish Madonna, and there's a crucifix hanging above. So this is a 19th century push to establish the Jewishness of Christ. And in Chagall's hands, after Kristallnacht, it takes on additional resonance of Jewish suffering, Jewish persecution. Of course, Jews aren't the only people interested in crucifixes. There's Emil Nolde, and Nolde in the Nazis' degenerate art exhibition in 1937. I like to describe Nolde as a super Nazi. Nolde was Danish, perhaps joined the Nazi Party in Denmark as early as 1920, was maybe a German Nazi Party member in 1930. He was Heinrich Himmler's guest in 1933 to the 10th anniversary celebration of the 1923 beer hall Push. So had a great career until in 1934 Hitler called him a pig and consequently ended up in the degenerate art exhibition. The text on the wall there says, "A witch put a curse on the German religion." There were There were 112 artists in the degenerate art exhibition, 650 works of art, but only 6 Jewish artists and only 4 by Chagall. The number 1 represented artist was Emil Nolde. This Chagall was in the degenerate art exhibition, but it's now in the Metropolitan Museum in New York City. Do you all, any idea how it got to the Met? Yeah, Nazis auctioned off what they confiscated to fund the war effort. So I spent years complaining about my museum's Emil Nolde, Girl with the Red Hair, because that's an auction piece. And maybe some curators overheard me because it hasn't been up for a couple years. I mean, when you're standing in the museum calling the artist a super Nazi, eventually they might take it down. So there's no guarantee. And there you can see the Chagall right there. And this says, on the wall text, some of it's cut off, it says, "Incompetence and impotence are the hallmarks of Jewish hatred." Chagall had at least 56 of his paintings confiscated from at least 18 German museums. I had my research assistant comb a typed inventory by the one of the Nazi departments responsible for inventorying seized art. And if you can believe it, somehow this is not a digital database in this day and age. You've got to actually look at a non-searchable PDF and count them up one by one. But she did a great job. This is the piece after Kristallnacht, White Crucifix. So, and of course, you can see Christ as a Jew, Nazis and diaspora, linking the Old and New Testament to present-day horrors. And this is in my museum, the Art Institute of Chicago, so I'm going to come back to it and say a lot more soon. That's George Rouault. Chagall, here on the right, is often compared to Rouleau, and they're often considered to be, a kind of naive medievalism. Although Chagall was a skilled artist, he's deliberately choosing to paint in this rough, rustic style, and there again, Christ is with the prayer shawl. We see the Mary Magdalene looking down at the ground. We see the growing theme in the darkness of these crucifix paintings, the suffering and murder of European Jews. We see Christ as the man of sorrow. Or here we see Christ wearing the phylacteries, holding the Torah on the cross. And we see the sinking ship out here in the ocean. That is the steamship, the Stroma, which was carrying Romanian Jewish refugees to Palestine, except the British denied entry to Palestine. They beached in Istanbul. The engine died in Istanbul. The Turks towed them out into the Black Sea. A Russian submarine sank it in 1942. 800 people, minus one survivor, died. So we can see the mourning there. Of course, we see this Jew with a sign that should read Ich bin Judah around his neck. We see the fleeing mother with the baby on her breast. We see the goat again. And if David didn't stress enough the scapegoat, right, straight out of Leviticus. So Aaron puts the sin of the Jews on the goat and sends the goat out into the wilderness to redeem for the sins of the Jews. And we see the mortars. Again, we see the fire in the pogrom here in the distance. We see the angel with the light. Hope in the darkness, but a lot of darkness. Another, so between good and evil. And here we see the goat holding up the book, clearly some sort of prayer book as the woman turns away. We have the crucified Christ on the cross. Again, you can see the prayer shawl instead of the loincloth. Again, the Jewish imagery in the burning village, in the pogroms. Or obsession, there we have our green Christ on the cross. We can't read the INRI, which should be there, but is not. We see the candelabra again, or the menorah. We see this church, which we will see again. It's a church from Vitebsk. So we'll see this in a number of his paintings. We see the red flag, perhaps the communists. Of course, the communist army and the communist sympathizers were perhaps both perpetrators or defenders. They were packed with Nazi Germany until that let them invade Poland. But in 1941, the Nazis attacked the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union. Of course, communism hated fascism, but of course there's no religion allowed. So again, an unclear symbolism in the painting, but symbols that resonate for the moment, but also for the history and the theology. We see the cart, we see the loaded up cart, the bird, the floating matriarch in the sky. Soul of the City. Bella, his first wife, has died by 45. She dies in 41. So we see her floating. We see him looking in two directions. That Chagall self-portrait. We've seen that face earlier. You can recognize the profile and the hairstyle. Looking at Bella, looking at the painting of Christ on the cross, dressed as a Jew, yet again, the goat. Of course, you can't help but notice the profile matches Chagall's face. The poem David read us from Blaise Cendrars talks about Chagall considering himself Christ. Of course, artists long considered themselves Christ-like figures and long-suffering, but he likens his suffering as a refugee Jew to the suffering of Christ on the cross, and wants to extend that to the condition of Jews themselves. Again, we have the candelabra. We have the red flag. And I'll share also one of Chagall's wartime poems. He wrote himself poetry between 41 and 45 in New York City. A Jew passes with the face of Christ. He cries, "Calamity is upon us. Let us run and hide in the ditches." And another one, of course, Christ as a clock with a fish. So the imagery there is passing time, time waits for no person, eternity. But of course the fish is the miracle of the fishes and Jonah. So the possibility of rebirth and salvation. Or Descent from the Cross, 1966 to 76. And I've just been marching this up from time. I started in 1912. So again, the Jewish Christ. Again, the refugees scattered to the wind. Again, we'll see this quarter moon over and over in the imagery. So this is a deep commitment by an artist over a long period of time to engage in this Jewish Christianology, or Jewish Christology. But this one's interesting. You know the stained glass windows, probably the America windows in the Art Institute of Chicago. Not a Jew, right, in the Cathedral of Notre Dame. That Jewish imagery gone. Maybe he couldn't get it past the priests, I don't know. But he's not wearing tallis here. Those are my students from maybe just a few days ago, because I spent the last 3 weeks teaching them in the Art Institute of Chicago. And we spent plenty of time looking at White Christ because I wanted to be well prepared for tonight. But that also gives you a sense of the actual size of the painting. And she's a hometown girl from Louisville. Went to Manual. Okay, let me say a little more about White's crucifixion. So after Kristallnacht, 1938, see the halo around the menorah? See the halo around Christ? See the man where you cannot read the sign that read, "Ich bin Judah"? That's because Chagall painted it out sometime between 39 and 41. He was arrested in Marseille on his way to Lisbon, on his way to the United States, and it's possible that he painted it out before trying to escape from occupied Europe. You can also see this white flag, which also once had a swastika on it, painted out. This man desecrating the synagogue, perhaps throwing the Torah into the fire, has an armband, once had a swastika on it, also painted out. People can't pinpoint the date. It's thought that after Paris was occupied, that Chagall thought it was too literal to make these overtly Nazis, though seriously, what else could it be? So we have the synagogue burning, we have that white flag. This is the Lithuanian flag. Lithuania was brand new at this time, until Poland invades it over a territorial dispute about Vilna. And I had pointed out Vilna on the Google map a little while ago. Here we see the Red Army, or Red Peasants, coming flying the communist flag. Of course, they're holding not guns, but they're holding farm implements. And again, unclear whether they're coming to defend the Jews from the pogrom, or whether they're coming to instigate the pogrom. The communists, the Russian peasantry, the red flag, this is ambiguous imagery. Again, we have an overloaded ship of people escaping. Here you'll notice, though, this man is He's raising his arms towards the Jewish Christ with the prayer shawl. Instead of a crown of thorns, he's wearing a cloth around his neck. And above, in addition to the INRI, Jesus Nazareth, King of the Jews, underneath it is the same Jesus Nazareth, King of the Jews, in Hebrew, but the transliteration of the Aramaic, which would have been the language Jews spoke in the Holy Land. This man, though, raises his arms towards the sky. One towards Christ, one towards the sky. Here in the burning village, of course, we have a man dead and unburied. We have this man here fleeing off to the right, maybe the wandering Jew, maybe the prophet Elijah. We have our faithful goat waiting next to this empty chair, perhaps Elijah's chair for his return at the end of days. We have this man fleeing, and you notice the Jews are scattering to the four corners, fleeing with a saved Torah, but only one shoe. He has what matters. We have this Jewish man wiping tears away from his eyes. We have this mother fleeing with a baby. Here, from the desecration of the synagogue, there's another Hanukkah menorah. There's a prayer book with a stand. There are books here. In an earlier sketch of this painting, there's the ashes from a Nazi book burning in the sketch that doesn't make it so clearly into the painting. We have the four Jews floating above Christ, three patriarchs and a matriarch. We have this Jew in the prayer shawl and the phylacteries calling back to the others. And of course, he's bringing them out of darkness and into the same light that he shares and they share with Christ. And then, of course, another desecrated Torah there on the ground. Later in life, Chagall would speak directly to this imagery. And he said, Christ symbolized the true type of Jewish martyr. For him, these are bitter personal messages with codes shared by Jews. Christ's passion, Jewish Christology, current horrors. And I will leave you with a final poem from Chagall, the Vilna Synagogue, raised by the Nazis in the 40s, or first damaged by the Nazis in the 40s and then raised by the Soviets in the 50s. Built a school on top of it, playground on top of it, all sorts of buildings on top of it. This is the Vilna Synagogue. This is Chagall's poem. Where are your Torah scrolls? The lamps, menorahs, chandeliers. The air, generations filled with their breath. It evaporated in the sky. Trembling, I put the color, the green color of the Ark of the Covenant. I bowed in tears, alone in the soul, the last witness. So I think David and I are happy to take questions.
What I hoped and thought was that you would do exactly what you just did, which is to really explain the goat, and even, can people hear this? To go into it a little bit further, and then the imagery of the crucifixion, of a messianic figure that takes on sin. This is coming directly from Judaism. I don't know if people read the Yom Kippur services. If they go to Yom Kippur or Yom Kippur services, there is a whole section of the service that's about the high priest taking the goats, the goat that is going to be led out into the wilderness, Azazel, that's sent out into the wilderness, and the sins of the Jewish people are put on that goat, and then another goat is sacrificed. And when asked about why goats, I mean, this is the reason goats are there. Goats were seen as, you could say, mythological figures. I like to put it within a Jewish frame of midrash, of the ongoing telling and interpretation of Jewish life. And just one more thing I want to add to that, and I'd be glad for you to jump in here as well on this, where the stories that we see in the paintings, even in a painting that evokes Christianity, are coming from Judaism. They're coming from Jewish culture. Chagall was not embarrassed about being a Jew. He was part of this Yiddish group that wanted to create an art and a theater and a literature that came directly out of it, what it meant to be a Jew, to create a Jewish peoplehood culture, and yet that would be also for world culture. Chagall's art was for the world. He was asked once, and I heard your quote about why he depicted Jesus so much, and one answer he gave was, like you say, he lived a long time, so he probably gave a lot of answers, but one answer he gave was also, perhaps I could have painted another Jewish prophet, but after 2,000 years, mankind has become attached to this figure of Jesus.
David has this exactly right. It's a way of keeping the tradition alive, the now and even then lost Eastern European folk life alive, but also an attempt to raise at least a semi-universal symbol of Christianity and tie the suffering of Jews back into it. So it does double duty. It's the folklore, it's the heritage, it's the history, and attempts to universalize that suffering and horror beyond simply a single man or a single people.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to me how, like I say, when I talk to people about Chagall and they're familiar with some of his work, and he's also put in work that's in churches, and there's a church in London that, all of the work that's in there was work that was done by Chagall. And then his biblical themes as well, which I think are in Israel. And the work that he has certainly is for humanity. His paintings of the carnivals and the clowns and the seasons and the 4 seasons that are in the Chicago open air mosaic that's right there for anybody to see it anytime they want. They don't have to wait in line at the Art Institute. It's like right there in the Chase Bank Pavilion. And these are definite, and he said, this is my gift to the United States. He gave it, and he put it into Chicago. But he was bringing Vitebsk, his Jewishness, wherever he went. And yes, he loved Paris so very much. And a lot of people don't realize also that when he escaped to the United States, and he and Bella were living in New York, they were on a trip to the Catskills. They were renting a place there. And as they were driving past some hotels, this was in the 1940s, late 40s, they saw signs on hotels that said, no Jews allowed. So, and this was not atypical in the United States. No Jews, no blacks, no Mexicans. They used the N-word as well. And she saw that. She got sick, probably strep throat. And he wanted to take her to a hospital in the area. And she said, they're not going to treat me. I'm a Jew. And he had to drive her all the way back to Manhattan. The trip was too long. The strep throat got worse, and that's how she died. So she died as a result of anti-Semitism, at least, quite, real application to that. And, this identity, which is so interesting to me, how that is often whitewashed. And you don't see it when people describe Chagall as one of the great artists of the world.
Well, and that's an important point, is not to whitewash it, because Chagall is tremendously popular and has been tremendously popular for 100 years. Chagall is actually pretty accessible. So I imagine that some of you, weren't so pleased looking at the Emil Nolde crucifix, whereas some of these Chagall crucifixes are a lot easier to handle despite the suffering. Chagall appeals to a much wider audience. It'd be a bit like nowadays if somebody like Taylor Swift came out as Jewish and started singing Hava Nagila.
I think she has.
It's an important role to be played by such a prominent Jewish artist who's making art that appeals to so many people, rather than some of the tougher, harder, more difficult, more off-putting modernism that I showed you from his circle.
Yeah, so I don't know how many more minutes we have. I can't reach my watch right now, but let's take some questions from people, and then we'll call it a night. And but we're interested in hearing from you, either in questions or in thoughts that you have about the paintings that you saw that we showed. Yeah, Sue.
I do have a question, but first I want to thank both of you, two Davids. I mean, it's great, and our hometown David Raskin, whose parents are in the audience. Yeah,
Yay.
Carol and Larry. PhD graduate. So thank you. It was really elucidating, and it sold out in one day. Wow. And because of that, I'm curious about your upcoming production, Chagall in School. First of all, how much space will there be in the room at the Performing Arts Center? Because it'll probably sell out quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly,
Yes, tickets are now going very quickly.
I know.
So get them.
Secondly, how much of the history and some of the iconography and the art of Chagall is portrayed in the play?
Wow, that's as if I had a plant in the audience. Thank you so much. No, this is a great question, not only because of what we talked about today, but are you going to be coming to this Russian epic, Dostoevsky novel? No, you're not. But you are going to come to this really interesting slice of Chagall's life that I had not known that much about. I knew there was
It's
an
fabulous. David sent me the script. I read the script. So interesting. Chagall's battles with the great modernists Elizitsky and Kazimir Malevich. Love it.
Yeah, I mean, the artists that were part of this institute, this little kind of, not very illustrious Jewish institute that James Sherman, the playwright, some of you may know his work, by the way. He wrote Beau Geste and the God of Isaac, and is just one of the fine playwrights coming out of Chicago, but has been done all over the world, and he's a good friend of mine. So the work that he does takes this little slice of a moment after the revolution, this little year-long slice where Jews were finally given the opportunity to have their own art conservatory. But it wasn't just for Jews, and they didn't want it just to be for Jews. That's why Kazimir Malevich, one of the great modern artists of that time, of which you probably know much more about than I do, I've known a little bit in relation to the play, but he started this form of art called suprematism. It's a real thing, suprematism. And there's dance and there's performance art that comes out of that, and it's going on to this day. Very interesting stuff. And El Lissitzky, who was Laser Lissitzky, and decides to change his name. He keeps shortening it from Elazar to Laser to El. I mean, he's strongly in the play, and it's about this little Camelot of time, where freedom finally was achieved by Jews and others who were able to get together and in an intersectional and humorous and romantic way explore what it means to create art, explore what it means for beauty to be part of who they are and that they didn't need to be afraid anymore. This is what they wanted, and they wanted their own Jewish cultural iterations intersecting with Russian cultural iterations.
Yeah, and that would have, there had been no place for that in Malevich's suprematism. This is the black square. So painting degree 0. Get rid of everything that looks like it ties into the life we live.
Yeah, and that's the conflict in the play. So that's what that's about. And this little moment, you know, kind of reflects on today as well. So come see it. I don't want to give you, actually given you quite a bit. So I spoiled a lot, but that's okay.
So one thing David hasn't shared with you is Chagall's a real horn dog.
Yeah. Well, that too, but that's not so much in the play. A little bit. A little bit. We made it family friendly. Don't worry. Yeah. Yeah. Please. Yes.
I'm still very touched of what I saw and what you did, and I have to admit that I really didn't know most of it. So thank you so much for bringing us here. And in a minute, I'm going to buy tickets for the show. And then I do want to share just a little thing that I'm not sure whether you know, that Louisville is the sister city of Mainz in Germany. And do you know what I'm going to say? Ha! In Mainz, in St. Bridget, are windows of Marc Chagall. And the themes are scenes from the Old Testament demonstrating the commonalities across Christian and Jewish traditions, winged angels, crowned kings, and so forth. Because the Monsignor in the, when did Chagall die?
85.
Okay.
1985, Chagall died in 85.
In the 60s, I can't remember the connection, but he wrote him and asked him, and he said, you know, we need no window in the church, and Chagall came and put this church.
Amazing.
And this is our little Louisville and Mainz connection.
Wow.
Wonderful.
We've
Nice.
been there, and it's phenomenal. So I encourage people also to go and visit Mainz, which is near Frankfurt, right in the middle of Germany.
Thank you.
Yeah, one of the little-known things I found out in exploring about Chagall's life is he's not buried in a Jewish cemetery. He's buried in a church cemetery in France, I think outside Lyon. And he had a home there, and his wife, second wife, some say, converted to Christianity. She was born Jewish, and she had wanted him buried there. And he knew that. He knew that that was going to happen, and he's not, you know, there's no Christian depiction, and some said, well, maybe Chagall converted to Christianity. As far as we know, he didn't. And one of the interesting stories is that when he was buried, you know, they came and they did a ceremony and did a ceremony at gravesite. Then someone showed up, and no one knows who he was. And after they did their ceremony, that person started saying Kaddish in Hebrew. Kaddish is the prayer for the dead. Yeah, anyway. Yeah. Any other questions or things that you want to explore? Yes?
Could you talk a bit more about Chagall's relationship with the theater? Because that's a whole area I don't know very much about.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I thought about actually going into that in much more depth. First of all, Bella, who had a distinguished life of her own. She was a writer, she was a poet, talk about poetry. She was in the theater, she was part of Konstantin Stanislavski's Moscow Art Theater. These were the theaters that were the progressive and art theaters that were going on. Jews were very involved with it. The Dybbuk comes out of the Yiddish play, the Dybbuk, comes right out of Moscow Art Theater and the beginnings of the Habima Theater. They were all involved with that. And when Chagall is kicked out of his own institute and winds up back in Moscow, he gets involved with the puppet theater there. And he does the set designs, and he does the masks, and he does puppetry, and in a way, you know, it's like another line in my play, you know, I get kicked out of my art world, so at least I have something to fall back on. I'll go into theater.
Well, yeah, and this is one of the things that people often forget is that this modernist ambition goes across all of the arts. Music, theater, visual art, literature. So Malevich does stage sets as well, so the fact that Chagall would be in Moscow doing scenic backdrops makes a lot of sense. They were exploring new ways to make art in as many different mediums as possible.
Right, and then his relationship with Boris Aronson, I mentioned Boris Aronson earlier, he did the monograph, people know. Boris Aronson became one of the most respected theater designers in America. And the work that these people did, they brought with them to America, the Yiddish theater, the arts, the culture, and that infused itself into American theater and the arts, not always so much in the art world, you probably know more about that than I do, but you know, even people like Marc Rothko, hardly anybody talks about his Jewishness. He was brought up right at the town in Dvinsk, right near Vitebsk. You go from Minsk to Pinsk, Dvinsk, Vitebsk. Amen. Great. So anything else? Yes.
I have a question. Was there any intersect between traditional stories and then Chagall's meaning of personal life? And obviously,
His Berlin stories?
yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. I mean, do you know anything?
I didn't come across anything
Yeah, I
directly,
don't.
but these people all traveled in similar circles.
Well, Cabaret, you know, and the whole stories behind Cabaret, and I Am a Camera, so that's interesting. I don't know if they had a direct relationship.
Like I showed the photo of Chagall and Picasso. These are people who would know each other and meet each other and be interested in each other's art.
And they were good friends, up to a point. Then Picasso said something anti-Semitic to him and they never spoke again. So actually, there you go. That A word. So, yeah. Well, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Speed Museum, for doing this. Go see the play, tell your friends, bring a group, we'll give you a discount.